Hebdige once said, "Subcultures represent noise as opposed to sound." He goes on to describe how they interfere with the ordinary, such leading real events and phenomena to their media portrayal, which often created a sense of anarchy. In this audiovisual essay, I'll be analysing the 1970s Northern Soul scene, exploring the rituals and commodities, how image and obscurity are integral to the genre, and how, despite some accusations that the culture has died, it remains to live on as a niche subculture in today's society. Before analysing Northern Soul in its entirety, it is important to establish its roots and the common links it shares with its predecessors. Deriving from the mod movement in the early 1960s, Wilson informs us that these two successive movements share many links, the most obvious being American urban culture and British white working classes. He goes on to explain that both subcultures involve an elaborate style with specific badges that allowed the like-minded to identify one another. It is important to note, when I discuss badges in this sense, I don't mean physical badges or patches themselves, but more so signs and staples of the Northern Soul image, such as clothing, hair, and accessories. Take a look at these men and women dancing inside a venue. Cosgrove once said, "They can predict almost every beat and clap in 1,000 unknown sounds." You can see that many men and women are wearing vests. Northern Soul events, often known as all-dayers or all-nighters, were often extremely crowded and would get exceptionally hot inside. People at that time were taking amphetamine, otherwise known as speed, to ensure that they had the energy to remain dancing for hours on end, so naturally they would become very, very hot. They're wearing flat-soled brogues or loafers, opposed to stack-heeled shoes which were mainstream at that time, again alluding to the sense of differentiation from the norm. This differentiation was essential to, as Cosgrove states, the ritual elegance of a dance style that glides from side to side but refuses to adopt a name. Wigan Casino, arguably the most iconic venue in association with Northern Soul, had found many of the younger newcomers come into the venue. Wilson tells us how they began to make the older members stand out, through their subtle differences in style. The young were drawn into the rush for the widest trousers, highest waistband. However, the older crowd stayed or added minor adjustments to the style that developed earlier, which involved Fred Perry polo shirts and standard Oxford bags. Trousers were extremely popular at the time. Suttle describes how commercialization brought a way of identifying those worthy of merit, trust, or power. Younger members of the scene would try and prove their worth with more badges and baggier trousers, however older members stepped back from the obvious signs. If we look at hairstyle, you'll see that most people had shoulder-length hair, or neat bobs with box-cut fringes. This was most fashionable at the time, and again, a continuation from mod culture which so heavily influenced the scene. One of the things which was most essential to bring to Northern Soul events was a bowling or messenger bag. Here you can see some examples. They were almost always covered in stitches and patchwork added by the individual, as not only a form of self-expression, but again, a way of trying to prove merit, worth, and power. People would often travel the country to come to these events, and so would keep a spare change of clothes or save their best shoes specifically for on the dance floor. They would always keep a bottle of water and attempt to stay hydrated, but also a side effect of amphetamine is a dry mouth. Apart from the reasons that I have just listed, the primary function of bowling and messenger bags, however, were to store records which people would either buy or sell or trade at the events. The art of collecting was a vital element of the Northern Soul scene. Shooker informs us how many collectors refer to the thrill of the chase opposed to the collection itself. It is the search that provides the rush of adrenaline and gratification more so than the idea of a final destination. In the book Record Collecting, Anderson informs us how 7-inch vinyls are strongly associated with do-it-yourself punk scenes, a subculture with relations to the Northern Soul scene, with its associations of anarchy and portraying the norm. He goes on to conclude how record collecting has remained a part of music consumption in this day and age. Despite the access to free music online, audiences have continued to purchase physical products. Obviously, this wasn't such the case during the 1970s, however many people which were a part of the scene in the 70s have retained their collections and still continue to hunt for the rare and obscure records. This gives me the impression that there is a huge sense of nostalgia still surrounding the scene. This idea of nostalgia would explain as to why many Northern Soul events continue to go on across the country. To get a real insight, I decided to attend one of these all-dayers in the footage you can see below. Admittedly, it wasn't too busy, but the event was organised by a small Bristol group called Splash of Soul. There's very little information surrounding their events, and I was required to join a private Facebook group where the owner questioned my intentions for exploring the page. This tells me that the obscurity remains to still be an integral part of the culture. To continue this idea, you can see that many people at the event still remain to be wearing the significant badges that Northern Soul was so famous for in the 70s. This meets the ideology of Anderton, who explains there is a sense of investment that these products offer in cultural, subcultural, and ideological terms. Although he is talking more specifically about records in this case, my belief is that badges, clothes, hair, bags, patches, etc., of Northern Soul fall under this category also. This is informed by Hebdige, who states, "The fusion of the subculture's subversive power, both modern punk innovations fed back directly into high fashion and mainstream fashion," and goes on to explain how, as soon as subculture innovations become generally available, they become frozen. This would explain the reasons for Northern Soul's so-called dying out. However, as time has gone on, and Northern Soul has left the pop cultural mainstream, it has somewhat returned to its original roots, an underground subculture which lies beneath the media. The Northern Soul scene is very much still going strong, with newcomers finding themselves a part of something in which they can relate to. This is despite the fact they may not have even been alive in the early 70s to experience its birth. Both young and old have found a medium in which they can relate to each other, whether it be through record collecting, as Stroll believes to be an obsessive cultural practice. Like anyone else, fans of Northern Soul have their own cultural identity, which Ward describes as a way in which we understand ourselves in relation to others. These identities contain a sense of self among a wide group, in this case, Northern Soul.